Oh, Lord.
DreamWorks' amazing Shrek 1. The original Shrek stands not only as a modern classic that absolutely changed DreamWorks' trajectory from bankruptcy to an animation powerhouse that's somehow still very much with us now, but also is a movie that just changed the way that animated movies are made. For better or for worse, depends who you talk to. On the plus, it was the movie that truly broke the industry away from being solely Disney-led, and would lead a decade of other studios getting a voice. On the not-so-plus-tacular, and talking about voices, the flashy Hollywood voice cast being a key feature of the marketing and subsequent box office success ushered in a new era of celebrity casting, effectively sidelining professionally trained voice actors from high-profile projects. Or I don't know, maybe you can blame Aladdin on that. Worse still, its success only added to the conversation that 3D animated movies are the replacement of traditional 2D animation, so yeah. Of course, everyone's currently on about the 5th one we have coming out next year, though in December, so still just under 2 years away, and being produced by Illumination head Chris Meledandri, oh boy. Though kind of interesting that it's now opening against Ice Age 6, as the original Ice Age was one of the first movies that Meledandri actually produced. Funny how things work out like that. But anyway, let's go back to when the tyrannical overlord of DreamWorks was Jeffrey Katzenberg, and look back at their original breakout hit with Shrek. Imagine the 1. There isn't a 1 in Shrek 1. Can you imagine if movies actually did that? Added a 1 on their first movie, even without a sequel in the works? Anyway, as the movie begins, as with any DreamWorks movie, I like to do a quick titles check. And this is a pretty significant one, as this was the first time we hear that iconic Shrek theme, which would go on to be adopted into the standard title card of every DreamWorks movie. But here, it's literally because this is the movie that this music came from. Immediately creating that sense of fairy tale whimsy, we go to a brilliant pastiche of the classic Disney book opening sequence. And I think this whole sequence wouldn't have worked as well without that initial sincerity. In order for this moment to be undercut, they fully understand that those first few lines need to be played absolutely straight. Not to mention that, despite this being the initial big anti-Disney swing, it still actually delivers the same function of setting up Fiona's backstory off the bat. Of course, the edge to this movie on release was its gun-blazing swipe at classic Disney movies, but it's easy to forget that this mandate was met from the first shot of the movie. And it is not subtle about it at all. After opening with the traditional Disney setup, you then have Shrek rip out the page, wipe his ass, and exclaim,
Oh, Lord.
Movies were just ballsy back then. Considering this movie is credited with deposing Disney's dominance, it is kind of perfect that this straight up 2 fingers to the company happens in the opening minute. I can already understand why they had to consult Disney's lawyers before even releasing it, to say the least. And then yeah, of course, we come to the classic. Somebody once told me. The sequence that I guess defined a generation. And its impact at the time feeds back into this concerted departure from the prior generation of animated movies. Sure, Toy Story opened with a non-musical song number over the soundtrack, but You've Got a Friend on Me is a tad gentler than Somebody. This was a consciously gruff and of-its-time track that established a sense of attitude to both the movie's agenda, but also, lest we forget, Shrek as a character. Like this movie as a concept, Shrek as a character is actively going against the mold of the world around him. Whether as his curmudgeon self, doing his own thing, or when he's later changing his ways entirely, he's a consistent subversion of traditional fairy tale norms. And yeah, part of this subversion is the farts and stuff. Not really my bag of humor, but hey, he's a literal ogre. I think in this context it's fine. And there's just something so visceral about the opening credits being formed out of these close-ups of mud, slime, maggots, and whatnot. Before you had the Edgar Wright extreme teeth-brushing close-ups in Shaun of the Dead, you had Shrek kind of doing it here. Beyond the song number, I really like just after when he confronts the mob. I mean, first of all, the juxtaposition of Shrek just getting on with his day whilst the villagers get ready to riot sets up the dynamic of this world very well. And as we discover in the confrontation, Shrek actively encourages the ogre myth, not because it's anything he actually does, but he just wants people to leave him alone. He's literally just putting the keep out ogre signs himself just so he can have his own space. Can kind of relate to that, honestly. an introverted protagonist. You wouldn't hear about that at Disney. But of course, every now and again, a group of idiots will try and tackle the guy. And as well as being hilarious, this scene's great in how it showcases Shrek as an intelligent character with him actually doing very little. All he does is talk to them, roar, and put out their torch in the most nonchalant way possible. Also, can we just appreciate this 2001 computer animation pulling off saliva physics so viscerally, of all things? You can even see it reflected on the mob's faces on the torchlight. It's so good. Yet, there's no doubt about his intimidating presence.
This is the part where you run away.
In mere minutes, you understand this character's place in this world and his attitude to that. He doesn't actually eat anyone, but he's more than happy for them to think that he does so that they can just leave him alone. You can see why so many millennials like him so much. And I love that they zone into him in his day-to-day life first, before zooming out to the wider fairy tale world. Starting off focused in Shrek and his swamp, make sure you know that this is his story. It's not all about the fairy tale characters living in the same universe. In fact, when you think about it, there's a version of this story that you could tell with just the original characters. Unless you count the messed up theory that Donkey is one of the transformed children from Pinocchio, of course. Classic. Nonetheless, when we do cut away to the introduction of fairy tale creatures, it is also a lot more than Jeffrey Katzenberg's notes to make as many jabs at his former studio as possible, though that was definitely driving a lot of it. Whilst those jokes are still in there is still a sincerity to this universe, it's not just a thin parody of Disney. It has its own concepts and shapes, which, according to this scene at least, is a notably dark one, as we see the 7 dwarves chained up in a row and the 3 bears in cages. Don't overthink what ends up happening there, or how exactly they would connect to the technical reappearance in Puss in Boots: The Last Wish. Anyway, we're introduced to a world where Lord Farquad's essentially rounding up fairy tale creatures and ultimately using Shrek's swamp as a ghetto. I mean, yeah, when you really look at it, that's right there in the plot of this movie, including the best on-screen version of Pinocchio, Fight Me. Yes, even better than Skitty Skitty. And it's in this scene that we first meet Donkey. We don't really know much about his time with this old lady, but it's clear she's quite happy to sell him off without a care. Don't worry, I'm sure she'll get a whole tragic backstory when we finally get around to that Donkey spin-off movie they want to make. You really had to go and be that good, Puss in Boots: The Last Wish, didn't you? But of course, he tries to absolutely mug her off, and who can blame him? And we as an audience don't even see him talking either until...
I can fly!
He can fly!
He can talk!
Again, the Disney homages literally soar in this scene. Even at a time when CG animation was still very much developing, they absolutely pack this and the subsequent swamp scene with fairy tale characters. Particularly for a struggling studio that's less than 10 years old, you gotta appreciate what they managed to pull off here. Also, considering what a hard time Pixar had developing human character designs around this time, I personally think that the human characters look pretty in this movie. It's decent, which is surprising because they're pretty naturalistic designs as well. In theory, that's more difficult to pull off than the more cartoony look. I mean, just look at old Polar Express a few years later. But for whatever reason, I never felt that with this movie. Anyway, Donkey runs off and makes his fateful crossroads with Shrek. Of course, a significant moment in the movie throwing these characters together. However, it's the unsaid actions that really matter here. As Donkey will call back to later on, he doesn't run away in terror from Shrek like everybody else, which you kinda just go along with here, but it's clearly significant to what becomes of these two characters' relationship. Also, I just realized that this first meeting is weirdly similar to Sid and Manny's in Ice Age the very next year. Not to add the conspiracy about those two. Anyway, on to one of the best uses of this line.
You in what army?
And from there, we begin to see why Eddie Murphy was put in this movie.
That was really scary. Breath certainly would get the job done, cause your breath stinks!
Donkey perhaps has the trickiest role in this movie. The character is supposed to be annoying for Shrek, and the audience have to understand where Shrek's coming from, and yet you can't make him himself annoying to watch. It's like a stage whisper. It still needs to sound like a whisper, but the audience still needs to hear it. Here, you've got to make Donkey annoying for the characters, but not for the audience. Which is why I think Eddie Murphy's 100-mile-an-hour delivery really works a charm. Not only can they squeeze in a lot of the ruder jokes and pop culture references through his snappy delivery in a way that kids won't notice, but also uses a legitimately funny form of comedy delivery, can also double up as a character who just talks way too much. The other thing about it that they absolutely nail on the head with this as well is getting us to buy into Shrek ultimately accepting Donkey's friendship as unlikely as it looks up to this point. A lot of real-life friendships consist of one extroverted friend and then the other more introverted friend who likes their own space, and I wonder if that's why people find these two characters so believable. Even that friend who just has a random song for every scenario lined up in their head, ready to sing. You know, we all know someone like that. And that's just another thing that feeds back into this movie's remit about being a departure from traditional Disney fare. A lot of the dialogue resembles the patterns of actual real-life conversations. It's not so much poetry as it is reality, with all of its bumps along the way. Anyway, it's still early days at this point, and Shrek has no idea what to do when faced with the first person to ever actively not leave him alone, let alone that person being an annoying talking donkey.
Like, I hate it when you got somebody in your face, you trying to give them a hint and they won't leave.
Despite this, Shrek does indeed let Donkey stay, but
Outside!
which hits the right balance for the character at this point. The fact he hasn't outright sent Donkey away does indicate that the more empathetic qualities are there, whilst not abandoning ship on the reversed grumpy ogre we've established already. I mean, who can blame a guy who's never been shown a smidge of empathy in his life? This is the first time anyone's ever bothered him besides trying to kill him, so fair enough. As Shrek settles down for dinner with Donkey outside, despite how horrendous the actual food he's eating looks, there's always been something oddly pleasing about this scene. Am I weird? I've had this moment where you've got an evening to yourself after a long day of work and all you want to do is sit and have some dinner, however scuffed it may be. Give Shrek some self-care points for that one. You can tell this is a routine for him, which makes the moment all the more cruel when the other fairy tale creatures appear and mess it all up. The lonely ogre just wanted to sit down and have his dinner, guys. It's so sad. Anyway, we first encounter the three blind mice on the table before...
Dead broad off the table!
Yeah, they managed to get through a lot of fairy tales here. Old Woman in the Shoe, the Pied Piper, though of course his bounty hunter reincarnating in the fourth movie is far more epic. Now just two bears. I think everyone already knows what happened to the mum in this movie, but we'll show the infamous clip in a moment anyway. The three fairies from Sleeping Beauty, three little pigs, more dwarves, a vague wizard-looking dude, some thinner dwarf-adjacent characters with pointy hats. Actually, these are kind of random, but okay. Believable, I guess. Also, don't look too closely at all of them. Some of the back ones are very, static. Let's just go to a solid joke, shall we?
He huffed and he puffed and he signed an eviction notice.
I love how this isn't exactly like adult humor, but actually understanding the more complex concepts and words from compared to when you were a kid really does make the original Shrek such a delight to see when you actually know all the dialogue, you know? I'm not saying eviction notice is necessarily going to go over a kid's head, but it's so refreshingly subversive when you don't know every line word by word. It's just, I love this stuff. Anyway, Shrek of course turns around and accidentally makes a vow to
Get you all off my land and back where you came from.
to much cheering of all things. Though, do we ever really learn where they were put instead? I know Farquad's influence was soon deposed by... But when they initially clear them off the land later, where did he put them? Anyway, I guess it's not important, as we have our first encounter with the guy in an all-time classic scene. Honestly, half of this movie is full of classic scenes, if not the whole damn thing. Even from the establishing frames of the milk being poured, the initial shots misleading us about Farquad's height, and they were on the money here. Before the character took a life of its own, just the concept of an interrogation scene with a gingerbread man and how they execute it is just absolutely astounding to me.
Eat me!
As a guy who does a lot of sketch comedy IRL, the whole concept for this scene very much pleases me.
The rest of that fairy tale trash poisoning my perfect world.
Indeed, Farquad's plan here is to keep the fairy tale refugees out of his kingdom and instead put them somewhere out of sight, out of mind. We never really explore this theme much further than that, as Farquad becomes more interested in how he's gonna become king, but I guess you could easily see why him becoming king would probably make everything a lot worse for the oppressed fairy tale creatures. I guess you could say that the fairy godmother and Prince Charming were a lot better realized as characters than Farquad, but I'd still say he's incredibly funny and memorable nonetheless. And honestly, I'm kinda glad they prioritized the main trio over going to him too often. For the role he plays in this movie, he works just fine. Thin a character arc as he may have, I still cannot commend the comedy writing in this scene enough.
Do you know the Muffin Man?
The Muffin Man who lives on Drury Lane?
I mean, the absolute audacity of it.
The Muffin Man!
And John Lithgow's completely serious delivery is what makes it take the home run. Even as we move on to the magic mirror, the interrogation room concept stays.
You were saying?
as does some preposterously brutal dialogue.
A mentally abused shut-in from a kingdom far, far away.
I mean, in what other context can you get away with a line like that? But that's literally the story of Cinderella. It makes sense. This is also just another example of how well thought out the fairy tale creatures' functions in this movie are. They're not contextual padding to make a point about the story they're telling whilst tearing Disney a new one, as much as that was the brief. The filmmakers took that brief and thought, how can we use them functionally? Magic Mirror? Well, we need to get to the point that Farquad wants to marry Fiona over the other princesses that coexist in this universe. Why don't we bring him in as simultaneously the TV and TV presenter, presenting Farquad with some options like a dating show? You know, obvious conclusions like that. Another touch I love is not only the guards joining in, but this absolute gem of a moment.
Three, pick up a dream, my lord.
Bless him. I also love that Farquad overlooking the mirror's after sunset warning is underplayed here in a way you kind of forget about it for a lot of the movie. It's these little touches that this movie has in its early stages that really pays off later that deserve a lot more love. And speaking of little touches, don't pay too much attention to his duvet. That is the rudest joke I am stunned they got away with. If not the very fact of his name is Lord Farquad. Or this very next one that's probably the least subtle of the bunch but somehow went over our heads.
Do you think maybe he's compensating for something?
As a kid, I even knew what compensating meant, but I just assumed it was because the building was tall, and he's not. Innocent kid me, you know? He obviously was referring to the skyscraper castle, which in and of itself is a nice modernization of the medieval fairy tale setting. Yeah, it's so many layers to these things. We're not even at the layers scene yet. And as if taking digs at their movies weren't enough, this is of course where Katzenberg gets his digs in about Disneyland as well. This is the bit where the argument that it's just about fairy tales in general kind of goes out of the window. This is a gloves-off anti-Disney moment. From the costumed mascots, the excessive gift shops, to the crescendo of the Welcome to Duloc song attraction. And it's that last line where we really get into lawsuit territory. For anyone who's been unfortunate enough to hear the original song from the It's a Small World ride, there's not a lot in it melody-wise. This is probably the most ferocious Disney takedown of them all. Although for anyone who's been to Shrek's Adventure in London, you can't help but feel some of the irony about this scene in retrospect. Glad that's gone. Kind of. Actually, it was ironically incredible.
Some of you may die, but it's a sacrifice I am willing to make.
Alright, time for the very first action scene in the movie, and it's a lot of fun. Shrek's got style too. He downs a pint and proceeds to knock all these knights out. It's a great bit of action, and a lot more engaging than if he just turned up to see Farquad and was just immediately asked to go get Fiona. I like that there's an extra obstacle, first reinforcing Shrek's place in the world with the tournament turning into a whoever catches the ogre gets to rescue the princess. But also, Shrek defeating them all also adds that extra layer to sell you on Farquad being convinced to send him to do it. Having Shrek do it in exchange for his land back is of course already set up incredibly well, and it just gives him a more convincing reason to do it than just you get to live, or just a knight doing it because it's their noble quest. They really thought about what would get this character to this point and why would he agree to do this. In order for the character to go on the emotional journey that he does, he has to be rightfully encouraged. It all leads up to this moment so nicely, whilst the overall shape of this story is not an immediately obvious one. It feels like all these events have just fallen over each other organically. And of course the fight sequence gives us a little insight into some of Shrek's personality and tone. He doesn't just come in punching with his big fists, no, he's a wrestler fan. For more modern twangs and references, using the ring that's apparently in the middle of this castle. He's a bastion of the working class. Just a big brute having a fun time along the way. Effortless and referential too. And so the quest begins, for real this time. Is it overshooting it a bit to say a large portion of Shrek is just a road trip movie? My favorite stuff throughout this is often just Shrek and Donkey talking whilst they're on this really elaborate country walk. You know, like...
Onions have layers. Ogres have layers.
It's of course actually doing a lot of storytelling and character building, but I just like the vibes of them walking through a field of sunflowers and having a chat. Even when Fiona joins, with the exception of the dragon and...
Oh, merry man!
For a whole chunk of the midsection of this movie, we're just alone with the three principal characters. There's an element of peace to the whole thing, and it's a bold place to take a movie that leads its identity with its edge and attitude. And the landscapes as well are also just another huge W on the animation throughout this. The reason it has those countryside walk vibes also has a lot to do with the fact that the animation is just so good. You just buy them being in this vast medieval world. Even the soundtrack for this section are lower key song choices that you'd expect to be in a road movie. The castle in a volcano guarded by a dragon. Less road trip movie-y. Hey there, thank you for making it to the halfway mark of this video. Come along and subscribe if you haven't already to keep up with any more amazing animated movies. And try to ignore the fact that I'm having a horrible bad hair day today and I'm actively fighting against my hair in between takes. Is that obvious in the footage? Anyway, enough of the background stuff, let's get back to the second half of DreamWorks' amazing Shrek 1. And yet, that sense of believability with Shrek and Donkey continues as we see them crossing the bridge.
Oh, this?
Yes, that!
Shrek may not have accepted Donkey as a friend yet, but again, we see real friendships with a dynamic like this. Speaking of dynamics, it's here we get our first introduction of the weirdest on-screen relationship in movie history. You can spend far too much time on Reddit reading theories on how the procreation actually worked. I wouldn't recommend it. But here, we're far off from the donkey babies, and it's just a simple gag. The dragon fancies the donkey.
I don't want to rush into a physical relationship.
Though I do like that we first have her established as just a fierce and threatening dragon before her more sensitive side comes out. From the initial dead bodies everywhere to the dragon itself, and of course her fire breath, the threat level's quite clear. Less sincerely, has anyone ever noticed the giant cookbook the dragon has of how to cook knights? I love background gags like that. This is a genuinely well-executed design for a dragon. It's like the definitive classic look of a dragon. Meanwhile, Shrek takes a literal hard launch in Fiona's life and greets her as chivalrously as you'd expect.
Wake up!
What?
At this point in the movie, Fiona becomes a comparison point with how the fairy tale version of this is supposed to go.
But this isn't right!
Which works for her function on this point and how Shrek completely subverts that, but is also established as a believable character trait for her to have.
You've had a lot of time to plan this, haven't you?
Considering she's just had herself and presumably fairy tale text and values to go by, it makes complete sense that she spent all this time anticipating how this was going to go. And naturally, you'd be upset in this position if someone suddenly just hurtled you out of it. As Shrek saves Donkey from something it'll ultimately come back and do anyway, we get an incredible chase sequence so iconic, there's a homage to it on the poster. And I don't mean to get hung up in it again, but I'm once again particularly impressed with how the look of the fire is in this animation. Again, this is 2001. It wouldn't have been easy to pull this off. Also, I love that it's just a running thing in these movies that Shrek just picks everyone else up in a chase sequence. Like for him, that's just easier. In fact, in general, his work smarter, not harder attitude informs all of his choices here, just like we saw in the fight scene earlier. Like, instead of fighting the dragon, he just tangles it up in its own chains. He's subverting the trope of how even a fight sequence is meant to go, with intelligence and environmental tactics, rather than a head-on collision. It's also that attitude that upsets Fiona with her preconceived ideas. Of course he's not going to stop to greet her properly, there's a dragon running about downstairs. However, once they're out of the castle when Shrek reveals his ogreness, it's a nice detail that Fiona's reaction isn't one of complete horror.
You're an ogre.
You know, it's a relatively low-key reaction, the world that's been established considered. On the rewatch, we know why that is, but otherwise, it's just so nicely underplayed here. I mean, she's not exactly nice about it either, but aside from Donkey, there's no huge reaction to it at all. With hindsight, you can almost hear all the thoughts moving through her head in that moment. We also learn a bit of Shrek's vulnerability pop out here as well. For someone who's otherwise just turned up as he is to everyone else, when Fiona asks him to take the helmet off, his initial refusal shows a degree of self-consciousness, opening up to a whole new layer to this otherwise very closed-off character, and expanding him beyond just being a thinly veiled parody subversion of the classic hero character. He has his own thoughts and emotions too. And after some unapologetically foreshadowy dialogue,
I have to be rescued by my true love.
Shrek goes back to business with a line delivery that just gets me every time.
I'm no one's messenger boy. I'm a delivery boy.
It goes without saying, but Mike Myers became iconic as Shrek for a reason. However, despite Shrek's no-nonsense approach to things, Fiona soon shows herself to have the same approach to things. Despite the fact that they are playing attitude tennis at each other, having these initial commonalities between the two pepper in those seeds of buying into their chemistry further down the line. And of course, we ultimately know why she's so insistent on it, but also at this point, it's not something that completely gives the game away either. Her wanting somewhere to sleep and keep herself to herself is nothing beyond the ordinary for a princess who's been locked away in a tower for years. Also, are there any theories out there about the cave being the one from Jesus' resurrection? I wouldn't have thought anything of it if it didn't have that big stone entrance as well. Is there something going on there? Shrek better not be making the commentary that Jesus himself is a fairy tale creature that's relevant in this universe. I'm guessing as a bit of a joke for atheists, putting it in the land of fairy tales? Maybe just put it down as a subtler little background gag for atheists. Maybe? I guess also Fiona does go through a transformation process whilst inside it, so you never know. Or maybe one more point on that is the fact that it's meant to be such a more subversive movie universe, and so maybe while Disney movies could be seen as having very Christian values, Shrek is saying, hey, we have atheist values instead. I don't know. Maybe someone or I will make a video essay about it one day. Don't know if I want to get into that rabbit hole. Of course, Fiona then quickly gets herself into the cave before sunset, with her being able to rip a whole section of bark off the tree being another clue that something else is afoot here. And once again, the landscape is spectacular to look at. Also, just a small gag, but I like this moment where Shrek and Donkey have a slight role reversal.
Shrek, what are you doing? Oh, come on, I was just kidding.
Again, only a small gag, but it really does just add a little bit of reality of these characters behaving and having a mind of their own. Which leads us into a lot of people's favorite scene in this movie. As I mentioned earlier, this movie deserves a lot more praise for its quieter moments. There are a lot of classic scenes, but it's stuff like this that really brings it together. Even just the visual of Shrek and Donkey sat together under the stars is just emotionally impactful. Especially for all of us who grew up with these characters. As you can imagine, I made an individual scene breakdown of a scene like this. I liked it so much. Of course, I've already done it before. Although this line may have gotten the astrologers to switch off.
Well, the stars don't tell the future, Donkey. They tell stories.
Classic Aries. Not just a quip, that one. Apparently that is actually Shrek's star sign. Who knew? There is a lot of character development we get in this scene below the surface, but I do also like that a bunch of it is just Shrek making up ogre stories. It seems like dialogue that an executive could have said, this doesn't move the story forwards, it's not even that funny, cut it out. But as well as how it segues us into the deeper talk, just having this extra pause makes you buy all the more into these characters. Also, this line would have been quite jarring if Shrek was directly talking about himself.
You know, Donkey, sometimes things are more than they appear.
But as it's brought in slowly with them talking about something completely different, it works just fine. And while Shrek tells Donkey that he's keeping the swamp for himself, Donkey proceeding to break through and getting Shrek to open up shows that their friendship has already been growing. Shrek might not express that to Donkey, but it's definitely there.
Who you trying to keep out? Just tell me that, Shrek. Who?
Everyone!
Which leads us to the moment that strikes the message of this entire movie.
Help! Run! A big, stupid, ugly ogre. They judge me before they even know me.
This continues to be a sentiment that so many people relate to. You have both prejudice as a whole, as well as the ignorant being scared of what they just don't understand, all in one package. The edgy humor and Disney digs are great, but this here is why Shrek made an impact as a character. If anything, it also makes the criticism of Disney more profound, as does the movie's resolution. From an early age, the Disney princess is introduced as an archetype of what beauty's supposed to look like. And having a movie that tackles how that makes everyone else feel is a really refreshing change of pace. As well as being a great moment for Shrek and Donkey's relationship, having Fiona overhear the conversation also continues to set up the understanding in that eventual relationship too.
I didn't think he was just a big, stupid, ugly ogre.
Yeah, I know.
It's a truly special scene. I'd contend one of the most iconic scenes in all of animation. And from tugging the heartstrings, we go to Farquad preparing to tug something else. I completely forgot these two bits were right next to each other. It is a moment, and it happens in the movie. And also, don't forget the final reveal of Mama Bear here. Jesus. And more than anything, it's the fear on the magic mirror's face that stays forever locked into my brain. Poor guy, he needs to go to HR about this one. Moving swiftly on, let's go to Fiona singing a bird to death. I do like the darker gags in here, and her both doing this and then using the bird's eggs is another unconventional way to set up that she's very much on Shrek's wavelength. The gesture, of course, also making amends for the friction the previous day.
We kind of got off to a bad start yesterday.
And as much as it pains me to say it, the subsequent burping sequence is great in further building their chemistry.
Thanks.
She's as nasty as you are.
Wonder what that's all about. And yes, we are then treated to...
It's still steal from the rich and give to the needy.
And I have to believe that the French accent is a nod to the fact that so many on-screen Robin Hoods have bad English accents. Them encountering obstacles like this going through the forest also gives me a kind of vibe of Monty Python and the Holy Grail. Whilst we obviously learn more about Fiona here, the Merry Men are only an obstacle in this movie for this bit. They otherwise have pretty much no impact on any of the rest of the story. It's just a fun, contemporary obstacle for the characters, just like a lot of the encounters the knights have in Holy Grail. Considering that's a direct reference in Shrek the Third, and both John Cleese and Eric Idle are in these movies, I think it's pretty obvious that there is some solid Python influence in the Shrek movies, so that checks out. Outside of that, it just adds more sections and obstacles to the journey that they're going on in this as well, making it feel more like a vast adventure that they're going on. Fiona dispatching them all Matrix style, because that joke hadn't been done to death at that point. We fully go into her and Shrek developing a chemistry.
There's an arrow in your butt!
As they awkwardly stumble over each other, you gotta give them credit that they sell you on these two chemistries before they've even revealed Fiona's also a half ogre. It gets the same point across as the Beauty and the Beast story, but for of course going the other way with it. Namely, Shrek's kind of more in the Belle position here, where he doesn't know about Fiona's other form. And yet...
Nothing happened. We were just,
Why do I love that he just chucks Fiona on the ground here? Time for the Shrek version of...
There may be something there that wasn't there before.
Complete with yet another song that would be a comfortable fit for a road trip movie. Shrek is a road trip movie. I'm gonna keep saying that until you believe me. Anyway, whilst damning a still alive frog to a torturous death in the Earth's atmosphere, clearly something going on, Fiona holding Shrek's arm by the end. I hadn't actually noticed that before. And I also love them gaslighting Donkey just so that they can have one more night together. It says a lot without spelling it out, and is another genuinely human moment, ironically. I think it's why I believe in their chemistry here, as is hearing Shrek audibly gulp before saying,
Maybe you can come visit me in the swamp sometime.
even with them eating weed rats.
rotisserie style.
This is such a genuinely sweet scene and shows a very different Shrek to the one we met at the very start of the film. The character development in this movie is so seamless, as of course is Donkey's dialogue.
Oh, come on, Shrek, wake up and smell the pheromones.
Imagine another animated character pulling off that line. Cut to the evening and it is time for the big reveal.
It's me! In this body!
But you ate the princess!
The threads of Fiona's personality all come together as it's revealed that it's more than her behavior that makes her like Shrek. It's a fantastic twist and would genuinely make for a good fairy tale premise.
By night one way, by day another.
Despite having all the references to other tales, nursery rhymes, and folklore, the best fairy tale in this movie is the completely original one they've created here.
A witch cast a spell on me.
And they also use this moment to go back to the core themes going on here.
And this is not how a princess is meant to look.
I much prefer the Disney critique here than some of the Duloc stuff from earlier on. Don't get me wrong, that's absolutely hilarious. However, whereas that felt like it was coming from a sour executive who lost his job at Disney, this is the scene that feels like it genuinely has something to say. This isn't a cheap joke, this is a powerful commentary that spoke to a whole generation of kids. And don't forget, Donkey being the best wingman ever.
You're kind of an ogre. Well, you got a lot in common.
Despite his motor-mouth comedy beats, this also showcases the kindness in this character, as we also saw in the prior night scene with Shrek. But of course, we can't immediately have the nice thing, we've got to have the misunderstanding, of course.
Who could ever love a beast so hideous and ugly?
It feels like every movie has one, but to be fair, this one does have a solid function. There's just so many movies with it, man. And obviously, to make sure that this plot point remains watertight until the finale, Fiona also makes Donkey swear he can't tell Shrek anything. Of course! Whatever. The morning comes and look who it is.
Princess Fiona.
Shrek gets his deeds back, everyone hates each other, time to play the sad song.
It's a cold and it's a broken hallelujah.
It's a beat that most animated movies hit, but it sure does the job. Donkey gets to reconsider banging the dragon, that's nice. There's a really smooth transition scene with Shrek throwing the flowers into the fireplace as well. But then, mopey scene over, we get a little moment of Donkey sticking up for himself.
I did half the work, I get half the booty.
I mean, he's not wrong, and Shrek still has the half with his house.
Well, if I treated you so bad, How come you came back?
Eesh, classic bit of toxic boyfriend dialogue right there. If a guy ever says that to you, leave. Please leave.
Because that's what friends do. They forgive each other.
One thing I notice in this scene is that Shrek doesn't reply to this with just going, "You're not my friend." It's something that a lot of other movies with this beat would go for, almost an easy way out. However, the filmmakers here show that they have a lot more of a nuanced understanding of the friendship that they've already established. With the under the moon scene earlier, it was clear that Shrek took notice that Donkey was the first person who treated him differently, and that he appreciated that too. If anything, Shrek's upset with Donkey because he's his friend. Yet he still thinks him and Fiona were talking about him being ugly and disgusting. And I like that a point is made of showing this friendship before moving on to the finale.
Friends?
Friends.
Time for the dragon.
I guess it's just my animal magnetism.
It's a crowd pleaser this moment. You gotta love some payoff. The Mungo scene in Shrek 2 obviously trumps it, but this is still a great scene and reveal. Even just them flying through the clouds showcases some spectacular animation. I mean, it won the first Best Animated Feature Oscar for a reason, even if I personally think Monsters Inc. maybe should have gotten it. And if the animation didn't do it, then I'm sure the subsequent gag with revered silence cue cards certainly did. A gag that I've seen repeated 1,000 times or so since. However, the one I prefer is when they call out this classic rom-com cliche.
It's a line you gotta wait for. Speak now, forever hold your peace.
To which they try to follow, but completely miss the line.
Oh, for the love of Pete!
It's just a gag that once again just captures the whole attitude of this movie to a T. As Shrek crashes the wedding, we get possibly my favorite Farquad line.
It's rude enough being alive when no one wants you.
Don't know what that says about me, but whatever. Beyond this point, the crux of the movie comes together.
What do you know about true love?
As soon as the words come out of her mouth, you can see on her face he knows exactly what it means. And that's all in the animation. I love the landscapes, but the information we get from the facial expressions in moments like this has to be commended as well. The vulnerability on Shrek's face as he hears the crowd laugh at him, as much as it was just a sign telling them to. You know, it's these touches that make Fiona reaching out for him all the more powerful.
Shrek, is this true?
And yeah, then the thing happens. Hooray! We've now completed the full reverse Beauty and the Beast cycle, bringing on our reverse Disney arc. Particularly close to home, as Jeffrey Katzenberg did literally produce Beauty and the Beast as well, just 10 years earlier.
Well, that explains a lot.
Only to be immediately undercut with an incredible recital of
Disgusting!
Oh, it's disgusting.
a solid send-off for this lousy character as... punctuated by another solid pop culture quip from Donkey.
Celebrity marriages, they never last, do they?
This movie definitely pulls these off better than a lot of other movies that followed it. This became the norm to stuff these references in because of Shrek, and like anything derivative, no other movie really did it quite as well. And it brings us nicely to the emotional climax.
I love you.
I just love how simple that line is. There's no poetic framing or overblowing this point. I love you is all you need from this moment and gets across absolutely everything it needs to. And even with this exaggerated Scottish accent, Mike Myers still absolutely nails these gentler emotional moments. There is true sincerity in his performance when he says that line.
I love you too.
And back to the Beauty and the Beast point, they completely bring it home by Fiona having a near identical sequence. Except this time, of course, she is still, I guess, in beast form. And that's the point.
I'm supposed to be beautiful.
But you are beautiful.
This is how this movie earned its stripes in pop culture. Sure, we then end off with another Smash Mouth song number, with Donkey taking over vocals in what would go on to become a franchise tradition. However, it's this scene that brings the story to a close in a way that encapsulates the whole story in one exchange. And whilst he's saying the line to Fiona, you can't help but feel that this moment has an air of Shrek accepting himself as well. It is the story of accepting yourself as you are, not what you're supposed to be. A timeless message through a modern lens, whilst in reference to older stories that are perhaps now more outdated than this material here. It may be a celebrity-voiced pop culture fest parody piece, but above all of that, it is a story with a refreshing take on prejudice that taught us that there is room for everyone to have a fairy tale of their own, regardless of how you look. And that is why DreamWorks' original Shrek 1 is truly amazing. For now though, I'd best end it off there. My name's been Daz, thank you very much for reaching the end of this video. Do tell me your thoughts on Shrek 1. I can assume it's pretty positive, and I shall see you all in a little bit.